There's a lot happening in the fast-paced world of EVs and EV charging. Dave Takes It On gives you a rundown of the latest stories. Well, headline news for most was the news that BP Pulse purchased $100 million worth of Tesla V4 chargers. I'm afraid I was less impressed. BP Pulse has set a budget of $1 billion. That was more important. An oil giant at last getting into the market big time. Do they know something we don't? Shell, likewise, despite announcing they were looking for a buyer for their EV division, have converted a number of petrol forecourts, reducing or eliminated the old petrol pumps and installing EV chargers. Both Shell and BP are down at the very bottom of my list as they both charge an exorbitant 85 pence per kilowatt hour. Wow! Are they ever going to be used except in desperation if nothing else is nearby? We'll see. Governments around the world with grants available often allocated by asking for bids from interested charger networks to make sure they get the best value. The winner will get the contract and install a quoted number of chargers and then receive the amount they bid. Tesla revealed that on a recent bid in America, the competitors' bids were hovering around the $150,000 mark per charging bay, while Tesla bid $50,000 per charging bay. Wonder who got that contract? EV sales are rocketing away despite the doom and gloom merchants. They latch on to the fact that EV sales growth has dropped dramatically, and it has. But do they actually understand that the sales of EVs are still growing exponentially? It's just the rate at which those sales are increasing has slowed down. EV sales this year will be around 50% higher than this time last year. Sorry, doomsayers, check your data. And talking of which, many people noticed headline news, Panasonic shutting down a battery factory due to no demand. And it illustrates exactly this point. I do wish people would read more than the headlines. Quick glance tells all. The batteries they make are the very old 18650s, now only installed in the Tesla Model S and X, which is a tiny market and shrinking. And nearly all the other EV manufacturers have long since dropped these in favour of 2170s and LFP and 4680s. So who exactly is still installing these 18650s? Oh yes, mainly Legacy Auto, because they're the cheapest batteries they can get their hands on. Well, luckily, they're not selling that many cars. All battery manufacturers are expanding and chucking out more of the proper batteries than ever, and there still aren't enough to cover growth. Well, not yet anyway. Well, motor services on the motorways throughout the country are seeing a huge increase in charger installations. Many already open, others being built. Roadchef is now just realising they are falling behind, and they've also just begun to install in numbers. We're seeing multiple chargers, often 6 or 12, now going in, replacing the hopelessly outdated single 50 kilowatt shared power units that we've got used to. What a refreshing change to arrive at a motorway services and find a dozen GridServe and a dozen Tesla Superchargers waiting. Not counting the absolutely incredible 58 chargers at Exeter services. Yeah, the site is a disaster, a major headache due to the layout. It is bad, but it can be sorted. Massive mega hubs are a great advancement. I'll be launching a new video shortly, which will track 10 mega chargers hourly across a 24-hour period to find out which are peak times, which are off-peak times. This will help people aiming for a particular site to get there at an off-peak time and find loads of vacant chargers. EV sales have stalled in the USA. Another headline. Really? Well, the situation's a bit more complicated. EV sales are booming as the price of a new Tesla Model 3 or Model Y is already below the average price of a new ICE car, $45,000. Yet EV drivers then get an amazing $7,500 allowance from the federal government and often a state incentive as well, bringing the actual cost to a little more than $30,000 for a premium Tesla. That's crazy. Many people will simply swallow their pride and overcome their hatred of EVs and all things Elon, and they're going to buy one just because they're so ridiculously cheap and getting cheaper. Now, the real problem is that ICE car sales are falling from a high in 2016, even with this year being slightly better than last year. The problem is the recession and high interests, combined with greedy legacy auto and dealers stocking top-of-the-range models as they make more per car than on budget models. Well, they did anyway, as the prices they've now reached are ridiculous when nobody is buying these cars. They're just sitting there in dealers. Well, talk about pricing yourself out of the market. And then they discover as much as 10% of that dwindling market is now going to EVs, just not theirs. Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, BYD, MG, Volvo, Hyundai, Kia, anyone but Ford, GM and Stellantis. And in China, for the first time, Tesla outsold the entire German EV manufacturing output in China. That's VW, BMWs, Mercedes combined. And all that was with just a single model, mainly the Model Y. Well, quick note here, just how incompetent is our government. They allocated £1 billion over 3 years ago specifically to build and expand the UK's EV charging network. And someone has just discovered that, well, actually none of it has been spent, not a penny. And does anyone get blamed? No. Oh, because we had so many changes of prime ministers and cabinet ministers, it's difficult to work out who was to blame. Well, let me give Rishi a good bit of advice. Just admit defeat and send the whole £1 billion to Elon and ask him to bail you out. They'll be installed and working by the end of the year. The new EV sales market for 2024 is looking exceedingly crowded and exciting. There's a mass of new cars coming and several new companies launching. At least that's what they tell us. Too many companies have a habit of not quite living up to those promises, and yeah, Elon is probably the biggest offender. By all means, give us a clue what's happening, what's likely to happen anytime you choose. But if you set a launch deadline, please stick to it. However, quite often when they finally do launch, everybody forgets about the delay, as the offering is just so good. There's so many stories about real budget models being launched. Citroën, supposedly with a 20,000 EV, and VW aiming for much cheaper than that. But also, what does launch mean? If you can't buy one as the non-available, the launch is a bit of a joke. I'll be keeping my eyes on this. We're now looking at some quickfire items for you. BP and Shell both report record profit yet again. And that's accompanied by the revelation from the International Monetary Fund that worldwide fossil fuel subsidies surged to a record $7 trillion. Oh, talk about headlong into the abyss. The FT, Department for Transport, states that plans will be updated to include the requirement for local transport authorities to produce EV charging strategies. Yeah, strategies, plans, yeah. But when will they actually act and start installing? Dudley Council aren't waiting. They're installing a network of street-side chargers across the borough and having talks for further locations in the next few weeks. Well done, Dudley. We'll look at EV versus ICE revenue. It's really interesting to see that Ford has 44 billion revenue, GM has 43 billion and Tesla 23 billion. Little old Tesla getting closer to the huge legacy auto turnover that's taken them 100 years to reach. And net income shows a win. GM 3 billion, Tesla 1.9 billion and Ford 1.2 billion. Oh, watch out GM, they're on your heels. But EBITDA, this is the earnings before investment, tax, depreciation and amortization, the measure preferred by those in finance to show the financial health and ability of a company to generate cash, has Tesla top with 3.8 billion, GM with 3.6 billion, finally comes Ford with 2.2 billion. Well, for a company that didn't exist 20 years ago, this is absolutely staggering. Well, historical news, Tesla Model Y was the world's best-selling car in Q1 2023. Legacy dealers report the customers do not want the EVs that they're producing. Well, what is this? Is this drivers getting good taste at last? Well, GM self-driving cruise cars now all operate with a safety driver following a tragic accident recently. Meanwhile, Baidu in Beijing, China, now rolling out driverless taxis with average fares around about $1 to $2 per 15-mile trip. That's cheap. And Tesla full self-drive available to all new Teslas shows off its abilities in a rideshare, with the driver doing nothing. See, many people have already been driven by a driverless car. They just didn't realise it because of the legal requirement in many cities to have a safety driver present. Back in my home county, Bodmin in Cornwall gets another hub, this time Instavolt. Well, there seem to be almost as many charges going to Cornwall as people who live there. We're getting ready for the heatwave next summer, no doubt. And Instavolt announced another hub inside the M25, claiming it to be the biggest so far in the UK. We'll see. For those who complain about queues at superchargers, please spare a thought for other places around the world. Maybe a 10-minute wait is not the end of the world. In response to comments, anyone for a canopy? Tesla listens and begins rolling out canopies. They'll get here sooner or later. When in California they generate masses of electricity, here with the weather we're just getting at the moment, it might just manage to light up the Tesla signs on the chargers. 1.8 million kilometres is over 1 million miles. The owner then found a leak in the motor coolant. This was repaired, reinstalled, and he was good to go for another 500,000 kilometres. You know what? That's the same model as mine. Is this a good omen? Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. See you the same time next week. I'm Dave.